Good morning and welcome to today's Diversity Professionals Group webinar, Leading with Equity and Inclusion During a Crisis. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to go over a few housekeeping items. My name is Allison and I'll be the webinar organizer for today. We want to make sure the presentation is extremely valuable for you, so we ask that you submit all questions by clicking on the question button in the control panel and typing your question there. Right now, please join me in welcoming Joanna Brown, Program Manager for Equity and Inclusion at the Greater Cleveland Partnership.
Thank you, Allison. Today, welcome to our Diversity Professionals Group webinar, Leading with Equity and Inclusion During a Crisis. We have with us today Gregory Jones, Chief Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Officer from KeyBank. He is brand new to the role, so welcome, and welcome to Cleveland and welcome to the webinar. And we also have Camila Negrete, Senior Manager of Diversity and Inclusion with PwC, affectionately known as Cami. So thank you both for joining me. My name is Joanna Brown, and I'm a Program Manager with the Equity and Inclusion Division of Greater Cleveland Partnership. Our session today, we will explore how businesses, both KeyBank and PwC, are continuing to focus on equity and inclusion during this unprecedented time. It is a panel discussion, and following the panel discussion, we will open it up for a question and answer. So we look forward to engaging with the participants, and we encourage you to submit your questions, as Allison said, in the question and chat box. So let's start it. Both of you can answer this. Can you each give us an overview of how your organizations are supporting employees during this crisis?
You want me to start? Okay.
Yes,
Hi, everyone.
Tammy,
This is
I'll let you start.
Yes.
Sounds good. So thank you for having us. Very excited to be part of this conversation. You know, I feel very lucky and very blessed to be part of an organization that has very quickly mobilized across a variety of areas in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in thinking about how to answer this question, the two things that stuck with me were really high levels of communication and transparency. That's really what we've seen from leadership in our organization and what we've been encouraged to really adopt as kind of ongoing behaviors. So it's, you know, what that means for us is leadership has established a consistent cadence to communicate with employees firm-wide across the United States, to help us understand how leadership is thinking about it, when will offices reopen, what might that look like, who are the teams working on efforts to understand how to keep our people safe, what enhancements they're trying to do to our infrastructure and our technology to enable people to work from home. We've been a remote workforce since early March, and all 55,000 employees were asked to work from home. The firm has been really supportive in reaching out to our clients and our stakeholders, helping them understand how we can work together virtually through this transition and supporting our staff in remaining, you know, safe at home. So I think it's really right. Lots of communication, lots of transparency about what this might mean financially for the firm. Lots of transparency around not knowing whether they will be able to financially support, you know, all of the pay increases and promotion that typically happen year over year. Lots of transparency around layoffs being or furloughing being a kind of a last resort, but not being able to take it off the table completely because we don't know what the next fiscal year is going to look like. And then a lot of communication around updates to benefits. So a lot of responses in terms of how the firm is taking a look at its benefits and adjusting those to support a different time under different circumstances. So at a very high level, lots of different areas that we can dive into. But again, I think the conclusion is really just unprecedented level of communication and transparency through this time.
Yeah, I would say that's pretty much the same thing with us, and I guess would be sort of a standard with most organizations. Like anything that we do here at Key, it's really about our teammates or our employees, our clients, and the communities that we're in. And so, as this thing came about, along with a lot of other business, there are several things that we quickly jumped into to support our employees. Um, we're already distributed, and there are a lot of people that work, obviously outside of Cleveland, and so there's some practices that we had in place that sort of lent itself very quickly to what it is that we're actually going through right now, whether it's flexible work arrangements, additional paid leave for employees if it's needed. Um, Specifically, when it comes to Corona, we've done some things around helping employees with testing. We'll cover the cost of those kinds of things, childcare reimbursement. So there's several things that some of it was in place, some of it we amplified to make sure that our employees are able to do and able to actually sustain this. Obviously, as always, safety is incredibly important in everything that we do and the concern that we have about our employees on an ongoing basis. We are in constant communication, obviously through email, through our intranet as people come on board for the day via their computers, making sure that there's all the appropriate things that they need at home in order to work appropriately. And there's a constant communication around what we're doing, not only in regards to COVID, but also tips on how to maintain sort of mental and physical health as you are as employees are going through this period. So, like a lot of organizations, KeyBank really jumped behind what we thought would be needed for people to find a level of comfort as much as you can in the times like this. And we're constantly in the communications that we're doing, getting ideas, getting tips on what different people are using to work effectively at home, to work more comfortably at home as we go through this period. So in general, that's what we're doing. So a lot of communications, to Cammie's point, a lot of communications.
Thank you. Has with this communication, I'm imagining that you're having to be a whole lot more candid and transparent with your employees, just to let them know, especially what you know and you don't know. I know with our organization, we've been having these town hall meetings, and they've been very helpful. And so I imagine that you both are having meetings where the staff can ask the tough questions, and then they can get the feedback and be able to make adjustments themselves.
Yeah, I mean, candid. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Kathy.
No, you go ahead. We'll trade.
Candid and transparent is the mode of operation anyway, as best you can, and and things that you can put out there. And there was always personal. I find strength in the ability to say I don't know, and so we're being very transparent with our employees, but we're also letting them know what we don't know, but we will find things out. Everyone right now is thinking about how do you migrate back to the offices? Do you migrate back to the offices? So as we learn these things, we're being very, very open about what we know and what we don't know, and the constant communication helps that.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think the only other thing that I would add in terms of communication, and something you said really resonated with me, which is the listening to your people, right? Because top-down communication and what leadership knows or doesn't know and how they're managing that communication is one aspect of that two-way channel. But I think when you provide infrastructure to crowdsource thoughts and ideas and resources, and you provide a space where people can do that, that's how you sort of build a sense of community, and we're not alone in this, right? So to your point around mental health and physical health, the firm started talking about this in webcasts that were 55,000 person wide, and saying, really take care of your health and make sure that you're leveraging our benefits. And we have mental health sessions covered by, the firm. But then staff started saying, well, how about we host mindfulness sessions? And so now we have 3 weekly mindfulness sessions facilitated by a PwC employee where thousands of people tune in for 20 minutes, 3 times a week, to pause and not get sort of caught up, in the midst of it. And it's very much citizen led. It's not top down. It's not us bringing in an external expert. It's people raising their hand and volunteering to say, I want to share my story because I think other people feel like me. And so it's leadership providing the virtual platforms and the organization so that we can facilitate that type of visibility and sharing.
I love that. I love the mindfulness sessions and the fact that the community is willing to come together. They have shared their needs, and the organization, PwC and both KeyBank, are being very adaptive, which is a trend that I'm noticing across the board for organizations at this time. With that being said, have you had any challenges in implementing some of these efforts? Like, as we are, I have a favorite analogy of painting a plane while we're flying. And so sometimes if you are painting plane while you're flying, then you can imagine paint is getting everywhere, and you're hoping that most of it gets on the plane, but there is a lot of it that's coming back on you. So what are some challenges that you have experienced during this time?
From my perspective, every step and every inch is a challenge and an opportunity at the same time. With ideas and solutions come the challenge of diversity. How do you serve, how do you provide solutions and options and alternatives to serve such a broad variety of dimensions of diversity and circumstances and life experiences? Because one solution is going to fit one population and another solution is not. Right. For us, I think, just to highlight in case there are others on the phone that are sort of going through this in their own companies and in their own organizations, we are in the midst of our performance management kind of year-end cycle. That happens at PwC in the April-May timeframe. And I think that it's been really, really challenging to, these meetings that take place in evaluating employees are in-person meetings. They're very engaging discussions. How do you build trust and comfort in your people's minds, right, around transitioning to a virtual environment and still maintaining a fair and consistent process that is going to give, to recognize the efforts and the impact that people have had all year. And so, that really comes into leadership being able to get on these webinars and saying, we don't know right now what we're going to do, but we're thinking about it. And we're soliciting input from people and we're bringing others along the journey. And when they have an answer coming and saying, this is what we're thinking of doing, and we know that there's flaws in the process, but, we're willing to listen and we're willing to kind of bring everybody along for the ride. And so I think that the change management aspect of all of this, and really helping your employees cultivate like that growth mindset of adaptability and agility, and understanding that we can't strive for perfection in times like these. We have to be kind and compassionate with each other and understand that everybody's just trying to do their best for everybody. And so I think that with whatever change you're implementing or whatever cycle it is that you're going through in your organization, the underlying tone that we've seen helps with the challenges is that of empathy and understanding and being thoughtful and suspending judgment and leading with curiosity and really having leadership and everybody in the organization message that on a consistent basis, all the way to the people who are, managing teams and continuing to keep that inclusion and belonging dialogue very alive through these times.
Thank you. Greg, have you had challenges?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of the challenges I would sort of align with what Cami has shared. And I think there's a theme that's popping up as we talk about this. The challenge is how do you make sure that you're communicating enough? And even though we talk a lot about communication and it's almost everything, how do you make sure that you have timely communications or you're hitting the right note at the right time with employees? And so I would say the biggest challenge, even though I think we're doing it very well, there's always room for improvement, is communicating at the proper time, at the right time, and the right level of frequency. I'm gonna say something too that is, hopefully hopefully it's understood. There was a quote by the former mayor of Chicago when he was chief of staff in the Obama administration, Rahm Emanuel. I think this is Rahm, who said, "Never let a crisis go to waste." One of the things that I'm finding in all of this is the behaviors that we look for diversity, equity, and inclusion is being shown as we try to make the organization continue to function in this crisis period. So the things that we're looking for in communicating appropriately with people, having a level of empathy and understanding of all of our employees, we're actually living the diversity, equity, and inclusion behaviors on a daily basis in order to make our businesses continue. And so, you know, you know, we don't want the crisis, but the behaviors that are being driven in the crisis are an amplification of those things that we are seeking to do and seeking to improve of on a daily basis, even outside of something like COVID-19 occurring. Hopefully that makes sense. I
It
just
does.
thought.
It does. I mean, what I'm hearing is that it's an opportunity for the organization to become a learning organization.
Yes,
Where
absolutely.
this
Yes.
is, systems thinking. This is, it's so many different leaders that we can bring into this conversation. But I think that COVID-19 and this whole response requires an organization to embrace adaptability, embrace pivoting, and embrace practicing. As Cami said, it's not going to be perfect, but you do have to try something. So, as you're trying and learning, then, we are able to be much more responsive to the needs of both our clients as well as our employees and staff. And so it
And
sounds like
we're all playing outside of our comfort spaces right now. It's really an interesting thing to see, and we're having to adapt and develop a set of behaviors that I would imagine are going to be even more valuable when we go back to our offices.
so. I have a question that's not on the script, but I think
Shoot,
you have
shoot
to flow
away.
with me.
Excuse me, I have to go to the men's room real quick also.
So as we're talking about this, being diversity, being senior leadership in diversity and inclusion, how have you seen empathy being shown in greater ways that had not been shown before? And do you think that that is something that we can continue to leverage as we continue to build upon your D&I programs going forward? Because empathy has been something that is not always experienced in the workplace environment, and if people do not feel like there's being empathy shown toward them, it's hard for them to feel like they're going to belong. So if you're trying to create a more inclusive environment, empathy is something that needs to be expressed for people to feel like they can actually engage and belong. So I wonder if you've seen any trends or in anything that has stuck out to you regarding empathetic situation that was empathetic situation I was in there.
I would say, well, first of all, I'm gonna start this by saying I'm only in my fourth week at Key. So I don't know when I get, and I haven't even been to Cleveland yet. I'm working from Chicago because of the crisis that we're in. So I don't know if any of my observation qualifies as trends or anything like that. But
Okay.
what I will see as an observation in general is, I had a phone call with a leader who was saying, I didn't realize how much, there would be times when a meeting would occur and I would call into the meeting from my office, even though if I walked, a few steps and down a floor or two, I would still take it from my office. But I really miss seeing the faces of my people or other colleagues. I think there is via teleconference, via video conference, there's a number of check-ins that I think leaders are doing now with employees that are probably, on the high end of what they would normally do if they're in the office. The phone calls, the video conferences, the town halls, the making sure that everyone's on town halls, being concerned and asking people how they're doing in the middle of a business meeting. Is everything okay? How's the homeschooling going? All of that stuff is an understanding that a lot of leaders are developing or getting a stronger sense of the importance of just those conversations with employees, not all the time, but frequent enough that they know that you care about those kinds of things. So I think an empathetic muscle is being developed in the middle of this crisis. Going back to our last comments, this is lending itself to certain behaviors that are having a lot of people play outside of where they're normally comfortable.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll actually echo some of that and share a story that I think, when I think about examples of empathy that I have come across, I could think of 100 different ones, because it goes all the way from people giving their time and their money and their, talents to people and organizations in need, all the way to just small acts of self-awareness and kindness. One that really stuck with me recently was I was talking to one person on a completely unrelated topic, and they just kind of had this aha moment in our conversation where they said to me, my husband continues to have to work, and I think for the first time ever in my life, I am experiencing a simulation or a version of what it feels to be a single mother. Because I am at home with my 3 kids, having to balance how to participate in an engaged and present way virtually in my work, homeschooling 2 of my kids, trying to keep my 1 kid that isn't, old enough to be occupied. And it has been traumatic experience in terms of just not feeling like I can have my act together in a way that I've had it before. And then their aha moment was sort of like, and it makes me wonder, I don't know if anybody in my team is a single parent. I don't know the circumstances that people have right now in their home going on that is not caused by a pandemic, that this is literally like what their life is. They're a single parent. They're the primary caretaker at home. They might not have the means, right, to have a nanny or somebody to help them out around the house with their children. And so that empathy muscle, like Gregory said, is very, very much at work, where people are starting to peep into each other's life experience in ways that they wouldn't be able to, right? And the employer always encouraging, like, get on video, make sure that you're being visible. That brings a whole nother layer of complexity in terms of D&I, because some of the conversations we've been having with our leaders is, have you ever thought about how your environment at home for work, of having a dedicated office with a dedicated desk with reliable internet, might differ from people on your team? What if you have a person right out of college that is living in a home with 5 different people, all of them working? One of them is in the front lines because they're, some sort of medical professional. None of them have a dedicated workspace. Have you thought about the worry that that person might feel in terms of shame or embarrassment in getting on a video call, when they're getting on the call with all these people that have all these fancy offices at home and they just don't have that? Because they're just at a different stage in their career. And so I think that when we start having these conversations and leading with curiosity and asking ourselves, I had never thought about how my situation might differ from the situation of others, and now I have an opportunity to do that. So what am I going to do about it? And how am I going to check in with people on a human level and not a work level to build empathy and understanding?
Thank you. And checking in on a personal level, then I will ask both of you to share an example of how you are being intentionally inclusive during this time. And we have 2 questions in the chat box. And so after this, I'll ask those questions and then we can continue our conversation.
I guess there are a lot of things that you wind up doing that you don't realize it, or that just come to you. I have been trying to be supportive, and I think everyone does this. And I probably shouldn't take credit for it in the space of being inclusive. Ordering from local restaurants and having them bring you food and supporting these businesses is my attempt at being inclusive. But it turns out I do that all the time anyway. So, so I won't count that one. But supporting the other businesses, whether it's barbers or cleaning services in this time of crisis, is what I've attempted to do to continue to keep things moving on. There are video conferences that I have with mentees to make sure that they still feel like the relationship is in play that I've started with them. So there are several things that you wind up doing on a day-to-day basis, especially when you're locked in the house all the time, that may seem selfless, but they're a little bit selfish as well. So.
And I think for me, at a work level, the way that I've just chosen to interact with coworkers and the time that we spend focused on execution of projects and tasks versus checking in on each other and spending time understanding how are you feeling and how are you doing. I think that I happen to be a very task-oriented person, and I am very much get to the point and let's move forward. And for me, I've had to sort of adjust that muscle a little bit to take a step back and say, it's okay to spend half of the call talking about how are you doing and how's it going and what are you feeling? And if you're having a crappy day, let's talk about that and let's spend a few minutes talking about that. So I think it's adjusting the way that you approach conversations overall. But I think also, externally, what I focus my efforts on is really amplifying fundraising opportunities. So I've taken to social media and helped colleagues that are taking active steps to fundraise for COVID relief organizations and helped amplify their efforts with my network and said, hey, I know that there's a lot of giving opportunities or giving asks right now, but if you can spare $5, here's a cause that I think is really worth considering. And so for me, it's really just the amplification of voices and people and circumstances that people might not be thinking about, and then trying to amplify sort of giving efforts through social media.
Thank you. Thank you both. So we have a question in the chat box that I'm from, trying to pull it up. I believe it was Mary Shankman that said it. It says, what are the specific steps an organization can take to ensure inclusive decision-making processes?
That's a fairly broad question. I think there are behaviors that you want to go for to make sure that it becomes a part of the culture. And so, you hear a lot of people talk about inclusive leadership. How do you get that? I think about how do you leverage the work that we do in diversity, equity, and inclusion, not as a program, but as a competency that's an expectation for leaders, and I mean leaders in the broadest sense in the organization. And so creating that expectation of being inclusive as you lead on anything, I think will drive a certain behavior of getting diverse input from across the organization if, in fact, people will be reviewed that way over time. And so building it into the leadership model of the company or the organization, I think will help facilitate some of those kinds of things to be
And I
inclusive in
and
discussions and everything.
and so, Gregory, something that you said around user input, right, or getting diverse input. If you happen to be part of an organization where maybe you're not there yet in your journey, right, that competency hasn't been sort of established and permeated in your culture yet, but you're trying to figure out how do we help our leadership look at things and make decisions in this pandemic through an inclusive lens. A practical solution that adds a little bit of lead time to the solution building process, but a practical solution is to create sort of advisory councils, right, of diverse individuals in the organization at different levels that can provide user input on ideas or concepts that leadership might be thinking about. So we are building the plane as we fly it in all of our organizations. And I think that when you are trying to drive initiatives, what you might want to suggest to leadership and executive level individuals is to say, how do we get a pulse on how what we think is a solution will actually work? How do we sort of prototype something on paper and put it in front of our end users to do some validation that our thinking is aligned with inclusive thinking? Because I don't know if anybody has seen sort of that graphic where it's kind of an engineering graphic where like the project requirements are one graphic and then the interpretation of the project requirements is something completely different, and then what actually gets built is something completely different that wasn't really what the project requirements were. And that breakdown of what is intended and what the actual result is, it happens a lot in organizations that don't have a pulse with their end user. And so things like focus groups or user interviews, even in a limited capacity, can help leaders understand that their perspective might be limited, right, by certain biases and blinders, and that seeking out opinions and perspectives of employees that look different and come from different backgrounds as them might actually provide a different way of looking at things and solving for things.
Would be
You're
a
on
really
mute, Joanna.
can you
Go ahead, Gregory.
what would be a really, and I haven't seen anything on this, and maybe you have, Cami, but in the spirit of how do you get ideas across and having more input, I wonder if people with that are natural introverts pay a price for having that aspect of their personality exist in a work environment in terms of input and things like that. It would be an interesting dynamic to see. And I think about this in the spirit of if, in fact, certain people are given the opportunity to input on a particular project or effort within an organization, does their natural instinct to be an introvert actually work against them in those kinds of environments? And if, in fact, a leader is seeing that, what do you do in terms of pulling the ideas out of people that may be a little bit more shy in the work environment? So just a thought.
That actually aligns with a question from I'm trying to find it here from Marcia Moreno. Can you share your best practices on how you're getting the opinions of your employees and clients on a consistent basis? Essentially, how are you making sure their voices are being heard?
So for us, it's been, because we are such a large firm and we have been making really strong investments in technology, we happen to have virtual platforms to be able to do that, very quickly deploy crowdsourcing platforms supported by technology to draw up the voices, concerns, and ideas of people. And so because of that, we've been able to implement things like ongoing pulse surveys that are very, very quick in terms of, we ask a question once a week to just understand how is the organization feeling. There are sort of crowdsourcing platforms where we are asking people, what is your why? What are your challenges? What are your ideas? And so leadership is sort of taking all that information and aggregating it and using to say, okay, we have a lot of people out there that are saying that, emergency childcare or elderly care or enhancing benefits around X, Y, or Z is a critical thing right now that is impacting a lot of our people. So how do we take that information and action it? And I recognize that not every organization is, this 55,000 person organization that has all this access to technology to be able to do that. So sometimes you just have to kind of go back to the basics and, to my earlier comment, really just figure out let's create a couple of staff advisory councils, right? And check in with people and just have a conversation about what are your pain points. And if you were to describe, the things that we're doing well and the things that we're not doing well, what is that? And how do we solve for it together? So if you happen to be in an organization where you have the technology to solicit input, to do pulse surveys, to do it on an ongoing basis to show people that you care, but most importantly, that you're listening because you're actioning it, right? You have to debrief on the results and you have to tell people, when we asked this question, the responses were X. And so we know that this is a pain point and here's how we're thinking about doing something about it. And so, Gregory, goes back to your early point of how little or how much do we communicate, right? And how transparently do we communicate? So what I would say is, as a best practice, if you do put effort to get the voice of the customer in, you should be prepared to figure out how are we going to action the results of the voice of the customer, because that is how you build trust with your workforce. What you don't want to do is solicit a bunch of input and then that go into limbo and people not see the results or the actions that the company is willing to explore as a result of that input.
I completely agree with that. There are all kinds of technology uses that you have for input. There's always surveys that organizations do. We're doing a survey now, thinking about how do we make our migration back to the offices? What do people think? What's some of the ideas that you have on how we do this? And this is throughout all of the levels within the organization. So there are all of these sort of larger or macro things that are put in place for people to have input. One of the things that I think is obvious for those maybe on a more micro level is, how are we really using our BRGs or our affinity groups or our ERGs, and what's the amount of input that they have in certain things, and whether it's in their local meetings, their chapter meetings, who gets to participate, and how are things structured for the organization for these voices to be heard from the various demographics that are represented by the BRGs. And so there are a lot of different approaches that you can take, but I think that's one that you could use it in so many different ways to make sure that voices at every level are heard within the organization.
It looks like there are several people in the chat room that agree with both of you. Specifically, Cami, your comments around introverts. Gina Chamarine says definitely yes, and introverts definitely have more difficult time getting their voice in the quote unquote room, which is in this case virtually. And she suggests that there are several strategies. For example, one, ask questions in advance of the meeting to allow introverted employees to consider their answer beforehand. Two, go around the room to solicit input, to solicit input as opposed to those who are inclined to raise their hand, et cetera. Sometimes you invite people to share rather than expecting people to always volunteer information. So those are some excellent points. And Greg, as you talked about the ERGs, Cami, I wanted to give you an opportunity because that was one of the questions that we were going to ask. Was there anything else you wanted to share regarding PwC and how you are engaging your business resource groups, or ERGs as they are called?
Yeah, and Greg, I love that you brought up the whole introvert dynamic, because I do think that at its core is critical during virtual times, and it's critical that we actually talk to our managers about, are you listening for the voices that are not volunteering the information, right? When you are in a virtual meeting, are you paying attention to who's contributing and who's not, who's on camera and who's not, and are you following up and creating trust and empathy with those individuals, right? And so to connect it to ERGs, we've been staying in close communication with our national ERG leaders. We sort of have a centralized and decentralized mechanism, in that we have local kind of networks and chapters operating connected to a national leader structure. And those leaders are the ones that are helping us really keep an ear on the ground. When early COVID-19 sort of started happening, and there was still a lot of activity, physical movement in the cities, particularly in places like New York City and other larger offices, we started hearing very early comments about the bias and the stigma of the Pan-Asian community in relation to COVID-19. And what is it that maybe some of our own employees or their communities and people that they knew were experiencing in terms of xenophobia and racially targeted bias because of the messaging that was surrounding this virus being connected to China. And so it was important for us to, as an organization, recognize that a large portion of our people were feeling scared and threatened and uncomfortable, maybe not because of what was happening in the four walls of PwC, but because we as an organization needed to recognize what was happening outside the walls of PwC, and take an active stand about what that meant in terms of us and how it wasn't aligned with our values. And so our ERG leaders have been a source of information, and our leadership has been listening to them so that they can address these sorts of things on even broader platforms than the ERGs, right? So ERGs have members, and they can have conversations about how they're feeling and create connectivity. And we've encouraged them and facilitated that level of virtual connectivity, but we've also then elevated their voices and their concerns to leadership and said, on this upcoming webinar, could you say something, right, around xenophobia and bias and the importance of us being empathetic to each other and recognizing that we all have an opportunity to understand and be aware of stigmas, and the importance of us being upstanders and taking a proactive position in intervening when we see something that shouldn't be happening. And so that's the way that we have sort of seen this play out, is at a local level, ERGs are doing a lot to bring some lightness and some connectivity and some compassion amongst their communities in a virtual capacity. But I think we've also, as an Office of Diversity, worked with them very closely to make sure that we are amplifying their voices to leadership, so we can collectively address, their concerns.
Thank you. We have, and thank you for correcting me in terms of who made the comments around the introverts. Appreciate that. Brian, we have a question from Brian Hall. This was, he says, we've seen that COVID has had higher impact on Black and Latinx individuals, in part because of the jobs they hold, which can't be done from home. Has this impacted your organizations or perhaps companies that serve you, food service, janitorial, for instance?
You want to go, Gregory, and then I'll go after you?
Yeah, I can't say specifically how it's impacted Key, but I can say that we are very sensitive to it. The fact that, as I said earlier, we are really focused on employees, clients, and communities. And from that aspect, we're very sensitive to it as we do the work that we're doing now, but also as we participate in some of the solutions that are being put forward in this crisis, whether it's a payroll protection program in which there's a lot of work that Key is doing as a bank, a large regional bank, in supporting the various communities. We are very much aware of what the disparities are in the community in regards to this specifically. And so, as we mentioned earlier, having that sort of empathetic ear is probably the biggest thing that we can do at this time, as well as pay attention to what's going on with our employees if, in fact, they happen to fall into these categories. And so I will say that leadership is aware from a community perspective and ready to do whatever it is that we have to do. As I think about all of the commitments that we've made to our employees as it stands right now. But to your earlier point, this thing is happening in real time. And so we can adjust as we get more information specifically around these communities that have been heavily impacted by this crisis.
Yeah, and I would echo a lot of that. The awareness and the sensitivity certainly is something that we've, again, kept top of mind and continue to dialogue in different communication channels. Where I have awareness of tactical and actionable things that we've been doing at PwC, it's really connected to our giving and responsible business leadership strategy. So we have an internal fundraising platform, and we also have the PwC Charitable Foundation, which is sort of our nonprofit arm of the firm. And we've really, we've supported efforts from individuals that are doing the fundraising. The firm has established relief funds specifically targeting underserved communities. And we've been trying to direct people, like keep those opportunities top of mind so that people can provide, financial relief along with matching dollars from the organization. So we've had, I think, on a smaller scale efforts of things like sewing masks and people taking time off to go volunteer their time on the front lines if they have any sort of skill to support underserved communities. So they've received things like, paid time leave to support them in their volunteering efforts kind of at a micro level. But I think at a macro level, it's really been around the giving. It's identifying those organizations that are focused on providing relief to underserved communities and having a concerted effort across 55,000 people to focus their donation on organizations that have been vetted as serving those communities and that you can contribute to financially.
I would actually, if you allow me, get in alignment with Cami on that. There's a lot of work that's been done with from Key in the giving space, both from a foundation perspective, but as well as a employees giving and gifts being matched by the organization. I will also say in the payroll protection program, there's a very keen eye on low to moderate income communities that we're serving, and we're making sure that we're standing appropriately and standing strong and being sensitive to those communities and during the time of this crisis.
Thank you. We have one more question, and I invite our attendees to continue to submit. The questions have been awesome. Benjamin Collinger asks, as offices open and companies are asked to monitor the health and surveillance, survival of their employees, what are the potential pitfalls from an inclusion perspective?
I was on mute. That is a really powerful question, and I'm glad that you asked it, because it is a very, very complicated, like there's a lot of complexity to answering parts and pieces of that question. What I can tell you is when we survey or when we poll our people and we try to get that voice of the customer in terms of what are your aspirations and fears and worries in returning to the office, the variety of answers and the diversity of answers and circumstances is so broad that it makes your head spin to try to figure out how to solve for all of it. And when you think about the potential consequences, unintended consequences that might have in the future, there's even more complexity. So to give you an example, if we have single parents or people that are caring for family that maybe are high risk, right? And they are terrified of going into the office to potentially get exposed to the virus and then, bring it home with them. That individual is going to have a preference to stay home for a lot longer than somebody who might not be surrounded by those circumstances. We also have staff that live by themselves in a studio apartment and are feeling really, really isolated and very, very anxious, and their mental health being impacted, and they're eager to get back to the office. They're like, I'll put on a mask, you can take my temperature, I don't care, you can track me. I just want to be able to go into the office. But then you start thinking about, well, those individuals that start going to the office and building rapport and familiarity, comfort, and trust with their colleagues, how is their visibility going to be potentially enhanced? And how is the visibility and the interaction and the trust-based relationships that the individuals who are not going to be in the office, going to be impacted? And what kind of challenges does that create in terms of consistency of experience of how you evaluate your people and how they sort of come out in the evaluation performance process in some of the kind of professional dimensions around relationships? So I know that I'm spewing out a lot of like complexity upon complexity upon complexity, but those are some of the conversations that we're starting to have is if we open up office, on X date, in addition to the PPE and safety measures that we have to be thoughtful about as an employer, how do we manage things like performance management and talent management and benefits and expectations that not everybody's going to be able to just come back into the office? And how are you as a manager or as a leader going to understand the different circumstances that people have to deal with in their lives to make intentional choices and to be supportive of people based on what they need and not what your assumptions or expectations are? And so it goes back to that theme that we've been talking about of the importance of leaders going that one level deeper and managers going one level deeper to not understand people's work and their quality, but people's circumstances and the quality that they're able to provide within the boundaries of those circumstances.
Yes. This notion of the office is that it looks different for everyone. And so as we are continuing to look at this, I mean, the organizations are, all of our organizations are really going to have to determine, okay, we have followed this certain model for so long, and we've gotten fixed and stuck. And when people would suggest that they could work from home, we were always, kind of resistant, because there is this notion that, well, I have to put my eyes on you to be able to know that you're going to be productive. Like you produce more work when you're in this kind of herd mentality. When you're in the herd, then I know what you're doing, and you can't go rogue. And so as we are looking at that, I mean, to me, the notion of the office is definitely changing, and we have to be very thoughtful, to your point, Cami, about how we are responding to that. Greg, did you have something that you wanted to share on that, or?
I think there's a lot of things that Cami covered that I agree with. I would say in a very simple way, in a very simple sense, one of the biggest pitfalls would be for, and I'm going to talk specifically about leaders, to, when we make the migration back to the office, to want to go back to the way it was. I think this period has put us in a transformation that we're going to be riding this thing out for a while. And so the temptation to go back to where it used to be would be one of the biggest pitfalls that I think should be watched out for. Things are different now.
Exactly. We have about 6 minutes left, and so I will ask a question. Um, have there been any new occurrences of bias or stereotyping related to COVID-19 that you've had to address and incorporate into your D&I strategy? If so, can you share what they were and how you chose to address them?
I can't talk specifically, but sort of the broader observation, and I think Cami made this earlier, was the immediate impact around the Pan-Asian community with this and all that went along with, um, the stories around the virus and so forth and so on. There's been real impact to our Asian brothers and sisters in regards to this, and it's a conversation that needs to be had and needs to continue as we go through this crisis. And so, um, in the sense that I will be thinking about that as you create strategy, or as I create strategy with my team, it will be a case study or a case that we will have as part of some level of discussion.
I have another question, Cami, if you.
My internet went out, but I'm still on the phone. I'm trying to get back on the internet, but go ahead.
Okay. Harriet Russell asks, how are you working in the cross-cultural realm within diversity and inclusion strategies?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
How are you working in the cross-cultural realm within D&I strategies?
So I hope that I answer the question as you intended. When I hear cross-cultural, what comes to mind for me is sort of the intersection of identities. So if that's not what you mean, please send your question, clarify your question so I can actually answer it. But if I think about it, if I interpret it from a place of intersectionality, I definitely, we are more and more, particularly in recent years, even before COVID-19, we've been talking about the concept of the intersection of identities as well as allyship. How do you take your systemic advantage in a particular moment relative to a particular situation, a particular group of people, to leverage that systemic advantage or privilege in a way that you are actually contributing to the solution and not adding to the problem. And so it's really just about keeping the conversation alive and giving voice to people that represent various intersections of that kind of cross-cultural experience. So being a parent of a person that has a disability, developmental or physical, is very different than being a parent of a child that doesn't have any of those challenges. And so giving voice to individuals and stories of people that struggle with different dimensions of diversity or that identify with different dimensions of diversity, and as a result of that, their struggle is different than that of their colleagues and peers, is how we try to address this concept of the intersection and the cross-cultural that spans beyond race, right? So if you are an individual who is African American and also self-identifies as part of the LGBT community, the intersection of COVID and how that is impacting your specific community is very, very different than how that is impacting an individual that maybe doesn't have those two identities. And so the way that I think about it and what we're trying to do is really through dialogue and through storytelling, is how do we, provide a safe enough environment that people want to share their stories. We've created some podcast series where we talk about what is it like to be, fill in the blank at PwC, and how might your experience differ from that of your colleagues, so that we're creating opportunities for teams to use, short audios and multimedia with discussion guides to engage in meaningful conversation about building understanding and belonging for everybody. And so I'll kind of close it by saying it's not an easy topic to address, because there is so much layers of complexity. But I think you just have to start somewhere. You have to start just looking for the stories and figuring out ways to amplify them and share them with your workforce.
Thank you. And Harriet did clarify that many people do not understand that it is not personal but cultural when workplace issues or conversations come up. And she was, you talked a little bit about this. Do you have trainings in or teams to address this? So much of diversity and inclusion seems to be racial, not cultural. But I think that we
talk about it as culture, heritage, and race, right? Like the combination of cultural heritage and race make up a person's sort of experience, and how we interact and convey that is very different.
So I have just one announcement, and I'm going to share my screen. And while I am sharing my screen, I want to thank Greg and Camila. We've had a wonderful conversation here about how both KeyBank and PwC are leading inclusively during this time. And I just want to personally thank you both for sharing this time with us. I've enjoyed the conversation, and we've had from the chat box, it looks like the attendees have as well. Do you have any final final comments?
My only comment would go back to the comment I made earlier in this. All of these wonderful inclusive behaviors that we're seeing via teleconference, video conference, all of these things that we're doing that are good from an inclusion perspective. How do we actually view this as a case study to take back when we go back into the offices? Something to think about.
Yeah, I'd echo that, and I'd say, slow down your thinking. Try to not make assessments and judgments about people. Rather than leading with judgment, try to lead with curiosity and try to help to inspire other people and leaders in your organization to do the same.
Looks like we have applause, and Tamika Taylor, she's left, but she said thank you for the good discussion. And I just am very grateful for what you all have shared, and I just want to discuss what's on our screen, which says that one of the things that we do at Greater Cleveland Partnership, our Equity and Inclusion Division, we have a diversity and inclusion organizational assessment. Usually that ends, we collect all the data from the previous year by March 31st, but due to these times, it has been extended through May 31st, to the end of this month. And so we want to ask people to continue to submit. You still have time. Both KeyBank and PwC participate. So thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing other people, other organizations that participate as well. And with that, I will close and thank our attendees. The chat box has been blowing up. And so we are very thankful and grateful. Stay well, stay healthy. And this concludes our Diversity Professionals Group. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. Take
Thank
care.
you.
All right. Bye-bye.